important than anything else. Now, there could be a couple things that you could possess that could be more important than anything else. What do you think those are? We talked about it in class. And our homes, reputation. I'm talking about maybe something that you can't possess. It's something that you have to do on your own. I think it is your reputation, and the other one is your example, which makes your reputation better, usually. Thus, the title of the sermon this morning is The Power of Your Example. The importance of our example. Let's think about that for a moment. When I was a kid, and I was running around the neighborhood, if I did something wrong, my mother and father probably knew about it before I got home. And knew about it, she whacked me too. It wasn't none of this stuff about we'll stick up for the child and we'll go and see the teacher and we'll do everything that's being done nowadays. No, that wasn't how it was. And guess what it made you do? It made you behave, unless you were an idiot like me. I usually get whacked pretty good all the time because I was always getting myself in trouble. We are creatures of imitation. If you hang out with a crowd, you're definitely going to act like that crowd. If you hang out with someone that's happy-go-lucky, that's probably going to be the way that your attitude kind of changes, hopefully. But if you hang around with somebody that never smiles or thinks it's the end of the world all the time, then that's how you're going to act. The old adage, like father, like son, is normally true. Except in some aspects, maybe, I don't know. You can instill in your children the right thing to do, but sometimes they don't do that right thing. So, this explains why examples are important in life. How many people here have hung out with the wrong crowd? I know I did. I hung out with the wrong crowd. But one thing my parents always instilled in me was, when you come back home, what's important to you is your name. Your name. You know, we have a family here that has a lot of heritage in their family, probably a couple families that have a lot of heritage in their family as far as background of religious people. And that name is important. Now, what's the power of your example? The power of your example is very, very, very important. As I mentioned in my opening this morning, it is very, very important. It is, I can't stress it enough, because if we come to this church building and we sit down and we act like a Christian, and then we go out into the world and act like the world, then what's that going to do? It's going to make us look bad, and it's also going to make the church look bad. It's one of the greatest powers known to man, really, when you really come down to it. It's a power that we all possess, but it's a force that we must handle also. We must make sure that we do what we're supposed to do. The Bible recognizes the great power of example by both good and bad. We get both examples in the Bible. One thing about the Bible, God did not pull any punches. If someone did something wrong, God brought it up. Brought it up to them, usually, in the Old Testament, especially when he talked to man. Good examples in the Scriptures are Noah. Built an ark for 100 years. Preached for 100 years while he was building it. And only 8 people believed him. What was going to happen? And the flood came. And the faith of Abraham. I'm going to read Hebrews 11, 8 through 10. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs which he with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Now I want to key into one thing in that verse. Not knowing where he was going. And I know I've brought this up many times, but every time I read that I have to laugh. I just have to chuckle, because how many times have you ever packed everything into the car and went and said, well, I'm just going to go, and then I'll wait until later till somebody tells me where I'm going. Now, you could load all the stuff in the car that would do you, but you got to remember, Abraham took everything he owned. Sheep, goats, servants, wagons, everything he owned, he loaded it up because of the faith he had in God. Oh, if we could only have that faith. Patience. Job showed all the patience in the world. And I have to give God credit for this, patience, because I'll tell you what, studying the Old Testament, if you study the Old Testament, God had a lot of patience with his people. Because if God would have been human, we wouldn't even be here right now. He'd have just wiped them out. He just said, forget it, it isn't even worth it. Courage. Daniel stuck to his faith up to the death. And God closed the lion's mouth because of his faith. Endurance. Moses. All the complaining, all the crying, all the moaning. Why didn't you leave us in Egypt? Why did you bring us out so we can die in the desert? He should have just killed him right there. Said, forget it, you're not worth it. We'll move on. Hebrews 11, 23 through 27. By faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child. And they were not afraid of the king's commandment. By faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer afflictions with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. For he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. And as we look at the Bible, we can also look at Joshua in the book of Judges. Now that's a lot of good examples, but there are some bad examples. The 10 spies. God said, go over and check out that place and come back and tell these people that we're going to go over there and take that place. But what did they do? They went over there and they come back and they said, them people were big. They're too big. We can't beat them. Because they didn't think God had the strength to do it. But all they had to say was, yeah, we're going to do it. And we're going to take it. But they didn't do it. The Pharisees in the time of Jesus that walked around with him trying to confuse the situation and trying to make him look bad. Someone has said that precepts tells us our duty, example shows us that it is possible. And as we go through the sermon here, we'll get to some points about Paul, by what he did, and that'll bring that to light. The Bible gives us many examples and illustrations, the great principles of truth by which we live our lives, and that we can live godly. I've heard people question why study the Old Testament. One of the main reasons I think that we possess it, even that God even gave it to us, is so that we can learn from the examples it contains, because it's full of examples of people that did good and people that did bad. In Romans 15:4 it reads, for whatever things were written before were written for our learning, that we through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. And 1 Corinthians 10:6, now these things became an example to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lust. Jesus is set before us in the Old Testament through prophecy, and then in the New Testament as a perfect example of what we should follow. In 1 Peter 2, 21 through 25, it reads, For to do this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps. Then it goes on to tell us that we shouldn't commit sin and we should live for God and have no deceit found in our mouth. The Apostle Paul understood the importance of example, and he was always aware of his own example. Because when he wrote letters to the church, he always told them to watch their example, watch what they were doing in front of people. And he wrote in 1 Thessalonians 2:10, You are witnesses, and God also, how devoutly and justly and blamelessly we behave ourselves among you who believe. And in 1 Corinthians 11:1 it reads, this is Paul speaking also, Imitate me just as I imitate Christ. He commanded others to set the right example. In Titus 2, 7 through 8 it reads, In all things showing yourself to be a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say about you. Paul was a great example of the things that we should do in life. As Christians, we are to be the example. We are to be the light of the world. In Matthew 5:14 through 16, it says just that. You are the light of the world. A city that's set on a hill that cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the room or the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Could this teaching be any more plainer? I want you to stop and think about the past week, about how many times you spoke to someone about Jesus. How many times you put forth an effort to speak about Jesus. Those who claim to be Christians are influencing people one way or another. You can claim to be a Christian to the point where you're driving people away and putting all the pressure on yourself as trying to be perfect, or you can live as a Christian and bring people to Christ. As Christians, we need to realize that the world is judging Christianity by us, by what we do. They're judging Christianity. Thomas Jefferson, in writing to John Adams, said, I always judge a man's religion by his life, for it is from our words that our religion must be read. And 1 Timothy 4:12 reads, But be an example to the believers in the world, in conduct, in love, in spirit, in faith, in purity. Words. Be careful what you say and how you say it. Manner of life. Never forget that people are observing your life. Never forget that. Love for God, Christ, and your fellow man. Spirit. What kind of attitude do you have? Are you an optimist or a pessimist? Faith. Your faith. Is it weak or is it strong? Is it little or is it great? Purity can actually help people realize your life because they even test you lots of times. When I worked in the hospital, people would try to tell a joke and I would try to get out of the room, and then eventually they just didn't do it in front of me. And that's the example we need to set. I want to leave you with this story about Abraham Lincoln. There was a man who treated Lincoln with more cruelty than anyone ever had. His name was Edwin Stanton. And he said of Lincoln that he was a low, cunning clown and had nothing but venom to say about Lincoln. Yet Lincoln never said a word, and actually when Lincoln became president, Lincoln asked this man who had called him every name under the sun to be his war minister because Lincoln felt that he was the best man for the job. And every day Lincoln treated that man with respect and courtesy. It is said that as Lincoln lay dying from an assassin's bullet, that Stanton looked down on Lincoln and said, "There lies the greatest ruler of men the world has ever seen." Why the change of heart? Because the patience of love had won the battle. Now, what do we think about when somebody does something to us? If somebody would call us names and do things like that to us, what reaction do we have? And we're going to have a human reaction sometimes, let's face it. But then when we come back to being a Christian, we may want to repair what we just did. And that's sometimes what we have to think about. Think about when you were younger and your parents knew before you got home what you did wrong. At least in my neighborhood they did. Think about that as God keeping an eye on us. Our parents weren't God, let me be clear on that. But God has an eye on us. God's keeping an eye on us. But the most important thing is the world is keeping an eye on us. Our example is gold. It's either gold or it's rubbish. So let's try to make it gold and make it shine, like our light should shine for the world. If there's anybody here this morning that would need baptized, we could do that for you. And if there's anyone here that needs the prayers of the church, we'd be glad to sit with you and talk and pray over any problems you're having, or pray to God that you could come back. Please stand as we sing.